In the late afternoon of November the 12th, 1930, a fur trapper named Joe Labelle was walking alone across the frozen tundra on the southern edge of what was then called the Northwest Territories of Canada. He was walking toward a lake. The lake was called Anjikuni. Today it is spelled a little differently, Anjikuni, but in the newspapers of the time the word was Anjikuni, and that is the spelling that survives. The lake sits in the Kivalik region of what is now the territory of Nunavut, about 600 kilometers northwest of Hudson Bay. It is one of a chain of lakes along the Kazan River. To the south is Enadai Lake. To the north is Yathkied Lake. The shoreline is bare rock and tundra. There are no trees. In November there is no daylight to speak of. There is wind, and there is the long blue twilight that in the north passes for afternoon. Joe Labelle had heard of an Inuit fishing village on the shore of the lake. He was looking for shelter. He was looking for a fire. He approached the village as the light was going. There were 6 tents on the shore. The caribou skin sides of the tents were still standing. The poles were still upright. There was a thin smoke rising from inside one of the tents, which Labelle thought at first meant someone was home. He called out the kind of greeting that travelers in that country called out as they approached a settlement, a long-held vowel that carried over the wind, so that whoever was inside would know that a stranger was coming and would have time to step outside. No one stepped outside. He walked into the first tent. The smoke was the last warmth of a cooking fire that had gone cold hours before. A pot was hanging over the dead fire. Inside the pot was the half-cooked remains of a caribou stew. The stew was frozen. The needle of a sewing kit was still threaded through a half-stitched section of caribou hide. A rifle was leaning against the inner wall of the tent. It was rusted. It was loaded. He walked from tent to tent. Each one was the same. Pots on cold fires. Possessions in their places. Tools where they had been left. He counted, by his later report, 25 people who should have been in this village. Men, women, and children. There was no one. He walked down to the shore. There were kayaks on the gravel. The lake itself was already frozen at the edges. The kayaks were sitting where their owners had pulled them up after the last open water in October and where they had stayed. He walked back behind the tents toward the small burial mound that every village of that size keeps at its edge. The mound had been opened. Stones that had been arranged around the grave were still in place, neatly arranged, undisturbed. But the grave itself was empty. And then he saw the dogs. 7 sled dogs were tethered to a line of stakes on the lee side of the camp. They were frozen in place. They had been there long enough to die of starvation, with their leads still on, at their stakes. This was a village in which something had taken everyone, all at once, in a way that did not give them time to gather a pot or a needle or a rifle, and in a way that left their dogs to starve where they stood. This is the legend of the vanished village of Anjikuni. This is Volta vanished. That, anyway, is the story as Joe Labelle is said to have reported it. It is the story as it has come down through 96 years of paperback books, magazine articles, late-night radio, and internet retellings. It is the story you have probably heard, in some form, even if you have never heard the lake's name before tonight. Almost every concrete detail in it is, by any reasonable historical standard, false. But the way that it became false, and the way that it kept growing, and what was actually happening to Inuit communities along the Kazan River in the years when the legend was assembled, is a story of its own, and it is a more honest story than the one the legend tells. So let us go back to the beginning and follow the legend as it was actually built. The first printed version of the Anjikuni story did not appear in Canada. It appeared on November the 27th, 1930, in a paper called The Bee in Danville, Virginia, more than 3,000 kilometers from the lake. The byline read, Emmett E. Kelleher, Special Correspondent. Kelleher worked out of the town of The Pass in northern Manitoba, which is about as far north as the railway went in those years. From the Pas, he filed human interest pieces to newspapers across North America. Stories about trappers, prospectors, miners, the mounted police, the frontier. The story Kelleher filed about Anjikuni was shorter than most modern retellings. He said the village had 6 tents and 25 people. He said the trapper Joe Labelle had walked in and found it empty. He said there was a single rusty old rifle and a few dog corpses. He said there was a stew pot and a fishing line. He did not say there were 1,000 inhabitants, or that the graveyards were dug up, or that lights had been seen in the sky. He did not say anything about kayaks battered by waves. He attached to his article a photograph of an Inuit camp. The photograph was a stock image from the archives of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, dated 1909. The article was syndicated. It appeared in the Halifax Herald and in a few other small Canadian papers in the first week of December. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police read the article and took it seriously enough to send a constable to verify it. The constable was Sergeant J. Nelson. He was stationed at the very town that Kelleher was filing from, the Pas. His investigation took about 6 weeks. On the 17th of January, 1931, he filed an internal report which was released through the office of the Commissioner of the Mounted Police, Cortlandt Starnes. Nelson's report was not ambiguous. He could find no foundation for the story. Joe Labelle, he wrote, was indeed a real person. But Labelle had taken out his first trapping license that season. 1930 was Labelle's first year as a trapper in the territory. He could not therefore have known the village for many years, as he had claimed. Labelle worked out of northern Manitoba, not out of the Kivalik. There was no record of him having been as far north as Anjikuni Lake. The photograph that Kelleher had attached to the wire story was, as Nelson confirmed, an archival image from the RCMP's own files, taken 21 years earlier. No request for assistance had been received from any Inuit group in the broader region. No local fur trader, no Mountie, no Hudson Bay Company factor had heard of a missing village. Sergeant Nelson noted in closing that Emmett Kelleher was known among the wire desks for what he called colourful stories. In Nelson's view, the article was a fabrication. That should have been the end of it. The Mounted Police had checked the story. They had filed it as untrue. For 28 years, more or less, the world forgot about Anjikuni Lake. Then in 1959, a man named Frank Edwards published a small paperback book in the United States. Frank Edwards was a radio broadcaster from Indianapolis. He had a late-night show in which he told stories of the strange and the unexplained. In 1959, his publisher in New York put out a small mass-market paperback collecting many of his radio segments. The book was called Stranger Than Science. It sold for 35 cents in supermarkets and drugstores. It sold very well. 3 pages of Stranger Than Science were devoted to the story of the vanished village of Anjikuni. Edwards did not cite Emmett Kelleher. He did not cite Sergeant Nelson. He did not cite any source at all. He told the story in his own voice, as if he had been there, and the version he told was not Kelleher's version. It was larger. It was more cinematic. It was sharper. In Edwards' version, the village had not 6 tents, but a population of about 30 inhabitants, which Joe Labelle had known for many years. The pot on the fire was full. The needle was in the seam of a parka. The rifles, plural, were standing inside the tents. There were not a few dog corpses. There were 7 sled dogs starved at their stakes. There were kayaks on the shore, and these kayaks were, in Edwards' line, battered by wave action. He added the detail of the opened grave. He closed the chapter with a single sentence. The sentence was this: months of patient and far-flung investigation failed to produce a single trace of any member who had lived in the deserted village of Anjikuni. The Mounted Police filed it as unsolved, and so it remains. Every clause in that sentence is false. The Mounted Police did not investigate for months. They did not investigate the village. They investigated the article. They concluded that the story was untrue. They did not file it as unsolved. They filed it as a fabrication. But Edwards' line was beautiful, and Edwards' book sold, and Edwards' line was the line that the next 60 years of the legend would build on top of. Through the 1960s, the Anjikuni story circulated quietly. It appeared in a few books about psychics and the paranormal. The details did not change very much. There was no internet yet. The story moved slowly. Then, in 1976, a paranormal writer named Dwight Whalen wrote a cover story for Fate magazine, an American monthly devoted to the unexplained. The piece was called Vanished Village Revisited. In it, Whalen claimed he had gone back to the primary sources. He claimed to have found Kelleher's 1930 article. He claimed to have found Sergeant Nelson's 1931 report. He summarized both. He concluded that the story was largely invented, but he allowed for the possibility that there had been some real ruin at the lake which Joe Labelle had stumbled on. Whalen's article should have closed the case again. Instead, it opened it. In April of 1977, the letters page of Fate magazine printed a reply to Whalen's article. The reply was from a woman named Betty Hill. Betty Hill, at that time, was the most famous alien abductee in the world. She and her husband Barney Hill had been, in 1961, the subjects of what is now considered the founding case of the modern alien abduction narrative. They had described being stopped on a New Hampshire road by a flying object and taken aboard it. The story had been turned into a book in 1966 called The Interrupted Journey and into a television film. By 1977, Betty Hill was a household name in the American paranormal community. In her letter to Fate, Betty Hill wrote that on a recent ferry crossing in the Bay of Fundy, she and Barney had met a former Mountie named Captain Larson. Captain Larson, she said, had spent 9 years personally investigating the case of the vanished village. In Captain Larson's professional opinion, the villagers had been taken from the lake by a UFO. There is no surviving record of any Captain Larson having served in the mounted police in any year. There is no investigation file. There are no 9 years of work. But Betty Hill said it, and Fate magazine printed it, and from that month onward, the legend of Anjikuni Lake belonged to the UFO community. By 1983, the British writers Nigel Blundell and Roger Bohr published a book called The World's Greatest UFO Mysteries. In their version, the population of the village had risen from 30 to 1,200. There were now 3 trappers named Laurent who had seen flying objects heading north in November of 1930. The Mounties were on their way to investigate the lights when Joe Labelle stopped them on the trail. Joe Labelle himself had sent a telegram from the lake to the mounted police headquarters in Ottawa, a feat that would have required a telegraph line within 1,000 kilometers of Anjikuni Lake, which did not exist. In 1988, the Canadian writer John Colombo repeated the inflated version in a popular book called Mysterious Canada, and People magazine repeated it in a feature article that fall. The story now had emptied graveyards in the plural. The story now had lights in the sky. In 2001, a website called Rense.com raised the population from 1,200 to 2,000. In 2006, the Canadian UFO report by Chris Rutkowski and Jeff Dittman added the detail that the dogs were buried under 12 feet of snow, although they had simultaneously been at their stakes and starving, which is geometrically impossible. This is the story you have probably heard. It is a story that grew, decade by accretion. Each writer added a detail. Each writer kept all the previous details. None of it is in the original report. Almost none of it is in Frank Edwards. All of it is now on the open internet, repeated as fact. In 1988, the Australian Skeptics, a small skeptical organisation in Sydney, wrote to the historian of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a man named S.W. Harrell, and asked him to verify the case. His reply, which is preserved, reads as follows. Many years ago, the members of the Mounted Police, then retired, who had served in the area at the time these events were purported to have happened, were asked for their comments on the story. They could not confirm it, recalled nothing like it, and were astounded that such a ridiculous tale could be believed. Our files were carefully searched. No strange craft was ever reported. No one named Joe Labelle ever came to the Mounted Police in panic about Lake Anjikuni. The Mounted Police did not send out any search parties. The only records we have on the story are copies of letters to correspondents like yourself, informing the writers that the story is entirely fictitious. This is the position the RCMP continues to hold. Their public-facing historical page describes the case as an urban legend. So if the legend is wrong, what was actually happening on the Kazan River in the years that the legend was being assembled? Something was, in fact, vanishing. The people who lived along the Kazan River and around Anjikuni Lake were a small band of the caribou Inuit, called in their own language the Kivalirmiut, the people of the inland barrens. The specific band whose territory included Anjikuni were the Ahiarmiut, which translates as the people from beyond, or more loosely, the out-of-the-way dwellers. To the north, around Yathkied and Baker Lake, were the Havakturmiut. To the south and east were the Pa'alirmiut. These were not large communities. They were never large communities. They were inland Inuit who lived almost entirely on the migration of the barren ground caribou, supplemented by lake trout and Arctic grayling. In 1893 and 1894, the Canadian geologist Joseph Tyrrell, on the first scientific survey of the barrens, estimated that the entire caribou Inuit population across the whole Kivalik region was about 2,000 people. By 1934, when the Hudson Bay Company began to keep more careful records at its inland trading posts, the Ahiarmiut numbered 80. Across all of their traditional territory, 11 family groups. By 1956, 22 years later, the Ahiarmiut were down to 30 adults and 25 children. 55 people total. 12 of the children were under the age of 5. The decline had several causes, and most of them are documented in the archival record. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919 reached the Western Arctic late. It moved up through the Hudson Bay Company posts and the trading routes and into the inland bands in 1920 and 21. Some caribou Inuit groups lost half their numbers in a single winter. Tuberculosis became endemic across the inland bands in the 1920s and 30s. By the late 1940s, the rate of tuberculosis among Canadian Inuit was the highest of any population in the world. Inuit families were taken south, sometimes by force, to sanatoriums in Edmonton and Hamilton and Manitoba, where many of them died. Some were never returned home. Their families were not told where they were buried. The caribou herd itself failed twice in the years when the Ahiarmiut were small and getting smaller. The winters of 1947 to 48 and of 1949 to 50, and again of 1957 to 58, were starvation winters. The caribou changed their migration route. They did not come past Enadai Lake. The Ahiarmiut, who had no fallback, starved. And finally, between 1949 and 1959, the Government of Canada, in a sequence of decisions made by the federal cabinets of Louis Saint Laurent and John Diefenbaker, carried out a series of forced relocations of the Ahiarmiut. In 1949, they were moved from Enadai Lake to Newelton Lake. The hunting at Newelton was bad. They walked themselves home. In May of 1957, the Royal Canadian Air Force airlifted the entire band from Enadai Lake to Hennick Lake, 72 kilometers from a trading post that the government considered close enough. At Hennick Lake that winter, the relocated Ahiarmiut starved. A woman named Kikik, in the depth of that famine, lost her husband and was forced into an act that she carried for the rest of her life. 2 of her own children died of cold on the ice as she tried to walk south to the trading post for help. Her story was recorded decades later by her daughter Elisape Karatak in a documentary called Kikik E1472, which is the case number that the Canadian government assigned to her family in 1957. By 1958, the remaining Ahiarmiut had been moved again, to Padley, then to Whale Cove, and then in 1959 to a settlement called Eskimo Point, which is the place that today is called Aviat. There are still Ahiarmiut elders today in Aviat who remember being children on the shores of Enadai Lake in the 1950s. There are not many of them. In 2018, The government of Canada reached a settlement with the surviving Inuit for the relocations. The settlement was for $5 million. On the 22nd of January, 2019, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations of Canada flew to Arviat and delivered a formal apology in the community hall. 21 survivors were still alive on the day of the apology. When the legal claim had been filed years earlier, 27 had still been alive. This is what was actually happening in slow motion on the shore of the Kazan River in the years that the legend of Anjikuni was being built and rebuilt in paperbacks and on UFO websites. There was no spaceship over the village. There were no 1,000 vanished inhabitants. There were no opened graves. There was no Captain Larson. There was no 9-year investigation. There was no telegram. There was a small band of people with names who had lived along the lakes for centuries and who, in the span of 40 years, were reduced from a hunting culture of thousands to a few dozen surviving children carried south by airplane, against their will, away from the only land they had ever known. The legend of Anjikuni is, in a way, the comforting version. It is the version in which the missing are taken by something larger than themselves in a single moment, with their tools at their feet and their rifles still warm. The historical version is the one in which a culture is taken slowly, by diseases and by federal policy and by the failure of a caribou herd, and in which what is left behind is not pots of stew on cold fires, but a small group of survivors in a relocation camp, sitting in a community hall 61 years later, listening to an apology. The lake is still there. Anjikuni Lake, on the maps, ungazetted, on the Kazan River, latitude 62 degrees 12 minutes north, longitude 99 degrees 59 minutes west, 444 square miles of granite shoreline and tundra, frozen in November, blasted by wind, indistinguishable in white light from the country around it. No one lives at Anjikuni Lake. No one has lived at Anjikuni Lake within the memory of any living person. If a fur trapper named Joe Labelle ever walked up to a village on its shore in the late afternoon of November the 12th, 1930, the mounted police could find no record of it within 6 weeks of his alleged arrival, and the writer who made the story famous 29 years later could not name his sources. But the question the legend was pointing at is the real question. How does a culture vanish? The legend says the answer is that something takes it from outside, in a single night. The record says the answer is slower and more ordinary and more human and harder to look at. The record says the answer is that an empire and a disease and a winter take a culture together across decades in pieces until what is left is the kind of thing that fits inside a community hall in Arviat in the year 2019, with 21 chairs. That is the story of Anjikuni. If you have a memory of a relative who walked into a community in 1930, or in 1957, or in any other year of the 20th century, and found it gone, leave that memory in the comments. The most important version of the question the legend asks is the version a family asks of itself when it is missing someone. I am the narrator of Vault of Vanished. Thank you for listening. If you are still awake,